When the head of a large family business grew old, he determined that it was time for his 5 sons to take over. So the father gathered his sons in the central office, handed each of them legal shares in the company, and laid it on the line. "Each of you now owns a part of the business," he said, "and all of you have to take your places and work together as never before." In many ways, Joshua did much the same with the tribes of Israel when he grew old. He knew that it was time for them to move forward without him. So he gave each of the tribes inheritances in the Promised Land and called for them to work together as never before.
This is the 3rd lesson in our series on the book of Joshua. And in this lesson, we'll look at Israel's tribal inheritances. We'll see how the 2nd major division of Joshua called the people of Israel to live together as heirs of the Promised Land. In earlier lessons, we summarized the original meaning of the book of Joshua in this way. The book of Joshua was written about Israel's victorious conquest, tribal inheritances, and covenant loyalty in Joshua's day to address similar challenges facing later generations. Just as in Joshua's day, the original audience faced the challenges of defeating their enemies, securing their tribal inheritances, and renewing their covenant loyalty to God. So, our author wrote his book to guide his original audience in each of these areas. To accomplish this purpose, our book unfolds in 3 major divisions: Israel's victorious conquest in chapters 1 through 12, Israel's tribal inheritances in chapters 13 through 22, and Israel's covenant loyalty in chapters 23 and 24. In this lesson, we'll examine the 2nd major division of our book, the tribal inheritances allotted to Israel. On a large scale, this division of Joshua consists of 3 main steps. It begins with the initial boundaries of Israel's inheritance in chapter 13, verses 1 through 14. It then moves to the specific allotments of inheritance given to each of Israel's tribes in chapter 13, verse 15 through chapter 21, verse 45. And it closes with a narrative that focuses on Israel's national unity in the days of Joshua in chapter 22, verses 1 through 34. Following this outline, we'll explore Israel's tribal inheritances by looking at each of these 3 steps. Then we'll close with some reflections on the Christian application of this portion of our book. Let's begin with the first step, the initial boundaries of Israel's inheritance.
As we saw in a previous lesson, the author of Joshua understood that Israel had inherited large regions of the land promised to Joshua. And this inheritance was a special part of God's ongoing call for humanity to have dominion over the earth. But, as we're about to see, our author also recognized that in the days of Joshua, Israel didn't receive all of the lands promised to their patriarch Abraham. Rather, God only gave Israel a foothold, a strong presence in a portion of it. But from our author's point of view, it was essential that every generation of Israel identify and secure the lands that were within those initial sacred boundaries.
We'll look at 2 dimensions of this record of Israel's initial boundaries. First, we'll note its basic structure and content. And second, we'll turn to the original meaning of this portion of our book. Consider first its structure and content. This section of Joshua divides into 2 episodes. First, chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, focuses on the boundaries of Israel's land in Cisjordan, the land of Canaan west of the Jordan River. And second, chapter 13, verses 8 through 14, gives attention to the boundaries of Israel's land in Transjordan, the territories east of the Jordan River. As we approach this part of Joshua, we need to keep in mind a bit of background on the boundaries of Israel's inheritance. In Genesis chapter 15, verses 18 through 21, God promised Abraham's descendants a land that would extend to the west from the Wadi of Egypt This wadi, or river, or brook as it may be translated, was either an eastern branch of the Nile that no longer exists, or Wadi el Arish, which still exists east of the Nile today. And toward the northeast, Abraham's land would reach as far as the great river, the river Euphrates. From there, Israel would spread the blessings of God to the ends of the earth. But in reality, Israel's lands didn't reach these boundaries until the time of David's kingdom. In Joshua's time, God granted Israel only a portion, a foretaste of these territories, on both sides of the Jordan. But as our book indicates, settling securely in these lands was a crucial first step for Israel.
Beginning with Abraham, God promised a people would come, and that people would be a blessing to the earth, would have important roles to play, but one of the things also would be that he'd give them a land. That's key to who the Israelites were. They were a people who, when they finally left Egypt and got that land, understood that they didn't deserve it. God had paved the way for them to get a place on the planet that they hadn't earned, that they didn't have any right to, but that he gave them by his own promise and his certain plan to make it happen.
The first episode on the boundaries in Cisjordan builds on the list of territories that Joshua had conquered in chapter 12. It opens in chapter 13, verse 1, with the fact that Joshua was old and advanced in years, and that there remained yet very much land to possess. The land that remained was in the region of the Philistines and in the northern regions of Canaan. In chapter 13, verse 6, God promised, "I myself will drive the inhabitants out." So in verse 7, God commanded Joshua to go ahead and treat all of Canaan as Israel's inheritance. In the second episode, in chapter 13, verses 8 through 14, our author completed his sketch of Israel's initial inheritance by describing the outer boundaries in Transjordan, the lands to the east of the Jordan. Our author began in chapter 13, verse 8, with the note that Moses had granted these territories as Israel's inheritance before he died. Israel's initial tribal inheritances east of the Jordan extended to the south as far as Moab and to the north as far as Mount Hermon. But our author noted in chapter 13, verse 13, that the Israelites had not yet driven out some groups, like the Geshurites or the Maacathites. Still, Moses had designated the entire region as Israel's inheritance by the time of Joshua. And to be as comprehensive as possible, our author also added a parenthetical note in chapter 13, verse 14. He explained that the Levites received an inheritance, but theirs was the offerings by fire to the Lord, rather than land.
The question of geography in Joshua is very important, and the boundaries of the land is a very important question, and so especially related to mountains. And what they do, they create a boundary of what the Holy Land will be, and it becomes this marker, this waypoint, if you will. The northern point of Israel is Mount Hermon, traditionally, and then the eastern boundaries of Israel are created by the mountains, especially of Edom in the south. And then the highlands of Moab, the mountains, the plateau, the hill country, if you will, of Moab and Bashan. So all across what is modern day Jordan, all the way northern Jordan to southern Jordan, that creates the eastern boundaries of the land.
With the basic structure and content of the initial boundaries of Israel's inheritance in mind, we're in a position to ask about the original meaning of these verses. Why did our author begin this division of his book with a sketch of Israel's inheritance at this stage in history? To answer this question, we must remember that in the days of the judges, the monarchy, and the Babylonian exile, Israel struggled to gain and maintain control over the territories that God had granted them. Conflicts among Israel's tribes, trouble from other peoples within these lands, attacks by desert tribes, and eventually catastrophic invasions by great empires like Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon repeatedly diminished Israel's hold on the land that God had promised to Abraham.
By reminding his audience of the extent of these territories, our author pointed out how important it was for them to secure control over these lands. It was only then that Israel could move toward gaining more lands and spreading God's blessings to all the nations of the world.
To convince his audience that the initial boundaries of Israel's inheritance were never to be forgotten, our author wove the 5 themes he'd highlighted earlier in his book into these chapters as well. In the first place, he pointed out how divine authority had established Israel's inheritance. He began his focus on Cisjordan in chapter 13, verse 1, with the words, "The Lord said to Joshua." And in chapter 13, verse 6, he reported that God told Joshua to allot the land to Israel as I have commanded you. Beyond this, divine authority also established the borders of Israel's lands in Transjordan. In chapter 13, verse 8, we read that these were the lands that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave them. The author of Joshua knew how easy it was for Israel to settle for occupying only a portion of these territories. So he made it clear that if later generations lost their devotion to possessing the full extent of these lands, they would be turning against the authority of God and his authoritative human representatives. In the second place, the author of Joshua noted that the initial boundaries of Israel's lands were secured by God's covenant with Israel. Regarding Cisjordan, God explained in chapter 13, verse 6, that all of Canaan belonged to Israel as an inheritance, or nachalah in Hebrew. As we noted in earlier lessons, these territories were called Israel's inheritance because, in his covenant with Abraham, God promised them as an enduring possession for Israel. And God confirmed this promise in his covenant in Moses at Mount Sinai. In much the same way, in chapter 13, verse 8, Transjordan is also called Israel's inheritance. By drawing attention to God's covenant in this way, our author's message was unmistakable. Every generation of Israel should acknowledge that Israel's possession and control of these lands was established by God's sacred covenant with their ancestors.
In the book of Genesis, when God establishes a covenant relationship with Abraham, he promises him really 4 things. He promises him many descendants. They'll number like the stars in the sky, the sand on the seashore. He promises that he's going to protect them, that he's going to be their God, that he'll be with them, that he'll prosper them. He also promises that, of course, they'll become a blessing to all nations, a messianic promise that the Messiah will come through the Jewish people, the Hebrews. But fourthly, he promises that the people of God in the Old Testament will have a land of possession, the land of Canaan. And it's not only a general promise to the people of Israel, but it's specific to the tribes, that each of them within the family of God, so to speak, have a particular inheritance.
In the third place, the account of Israel's initial boundaries also stressed that they accorded with the standard of Moses' law. For example, in the opening of the section on Cisjordan, God said in chapter 13, verse 1, "There remains yet very much land to possess." This wasn't a new revelation. It was based on areas that Moses had directed Israel to possess in passages like Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 and 17. In much the same way, when it came to Transjordan, chapter 13, verse 8 refers to their inheritance, which Moses gave them. The law of Moses granted possession of these lands across the Jordan in passages like Numbers chapter 32, verses 33 through 42, and Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 8 through 17. The author of Joshua drew attention to the law of Moses to address anyone in his audience who questioned their need to possess Israel's initial tribal inheritances. Moses himself had commanded Israel to take control of these territories. In the fourth place, as our author dealt with the initial boundaries of Israel's territories, he also drew attention to God's supernatural power. In the section dealing with Cisjordan, God said in chapter 13, verse 6, "I myself will drive the remaining Canaanites out from before the people of Israel." And in the episode dealing with Transjordan, he noted that possession of these lands resulted from supernatural victories that God had granted Moses. In chapter 13, verse 10, he referred to the well-known miraculous victory over Sihon, king of the Amorites. And in verse 12, he recalled the miraculous victory over Og in Bashan. Both of these episodes indicated to the original audience that they must put their hope in divine intervention on their behalf. Only then could they realistically hope to gain and hold their inheritance in Cisjordan and Transjordan. In the fifth place, the record of Israel's initial boundaries also focused on the participation of all Israel. Chapter 13, verse 7 notes that Cisjordan was to be divided among the 9 tribes and half the tribe of Manasseh. Chapter 13, verse 8 mentions the Transjordan was the inheritance of the other half of the tribe of Manasseh, the Reubenites and the Gadites. To highlight the theme of all Israel even further, chapter 13, verse 14 also mentions the special inheritance of the tribe of Levi. As he stressed time and again, our author made it clear to his original audience that the tribes of Israel must stand together. The unity of the people of God was essential to establishing their presence throughout the initial boundaries on both sides of the Jordan.